Dawn had yet to break over Oahu on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the Pacific sky tightened like a drumhead waiting for the first blow. Pearl Harbor breathed in silence, waves tapping gently against the hull of the USS Arizona, a careless lullaby before the steel storm about to crash down. American sailors ate breakfast, laughter mixing with the smell of fresh coffee and the soft murmur of the radio. Everyone believed today would be just like any other. But beyond the horizon, where the mist had not yet lifted, small black specks grew larger. Not migrating birds, but Japanese fighters with engines growling in their steel throats, carrying bombs, torpedoes, and the resolve of an empire strangled by an oil embargo. The sea lay too smooth, too calm, the kind of stillness that becomes its own warning, history holding its breath before the first explosion tears open an era. 6 Japanese carriers sliced forward like the shadows of hidden leviathans, radios dead silent, not a single signal escaping. Only engines and intention. The world did not yet know it was seconds away from a turning point where steel would ignite, ships would split apart, and the balance of global power would be rewritten. The sun had not fully risen, but war was already arriving like thunder without lightning. Pearl Harbor, in just a moment, would no longer be a harbor, but the mouth of a volcano newly awakened. Before the bombs fell, before steel shattered and the waters of Hawaii turned into a mirror of fire, the Pacific had already endured more than a decade stretched taut, like a bowstring pulled to its final limit. Japan entered the 1930s not as a humble island nation, but as an empire loudly demanding its share of the world map. After defeating Russia in 1905, Japan believed it was strong enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with the European powers. Industry surged. Warships were launched in waves. Weapons, naval guns, and aircraft multiplied like a swarm of steel bees waiting to burst from the hive. But Japan's natural resources were as scarce as the last breaths of a mountaineer caught in a blizzard. Lacking oil, lacking iron, lacking rubber, lacking the lifeblood needed to feed a war machine growing like a starving beast. Japan's arms stretched toward China, seizing Manchuria in 1931, plunging deeper into the mainland in 1937, leaving Nanjing burning red with tens of thousands of corpses. The world watched, horrified yet powerless. Japan did not retreat an inch. The United States stood then as the keeper of the balance. America had interests in China, allies in Britain and the Netherlands, and trade routes running across the Pacific like nerves connecting the global economy. They watched Japan expand like a rising tide, each advance a knife into regional stability. When Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in 1940, the US understood this was no longer a regional conflict but a global strategic threat. Washington began tightening the vice, first restricting steel, then aircraft, and by July 1941 cutting off oil and freezing Japanese assets. The oil barrels that once flowed from California now sat motionless, like blood congealing in an artery. Japan had less than a year of military fuel reserves. The clock began to tick. In Tokyo's political backrooms, the militarists did not sleep. They believed the survival of the empire depended on territorial expansion for resources. French Indochina was in reach. The Dutch East Indies overflowed with oil. Malaya held rubber. If America was the gatekeeper, Japan intended to smash the gate with a hammer, not knock politely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, keenly aware that American industry could produce warships like an endless steel foundry, knew that a total war with the US might be a stroke that rebounds upon the wielder. Yet he also understood, inaction meant slow suicide. While a surprise attack might buy months, perhaps years, enough time to build a defensive perimeter and force America to pay dearly for every mile of advance. And so the plan was drawn, sharp as a sword edge under moonlight. The target would be Pearl Harbor, the largest American naval base in the Pacific, where the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, and others lay at anchor like sleeping giants by the shore. Strike the fleet in one blow, and Japan could sweep into Southeast Asia, seize the Dutch oil fields, push the British out of Singapore, isolate the Philippines, and cripple America long enough to prevent an immediate counterattack. Yamamoto knew the risk was immense, but there was no alternative. Japan had to attack, fast, hard, and like lightning from a clear sky. On November 26, 1941, the Kido Butai Strike Force, the spear point of Japan, silently left Hitokapu Bay. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Suikaku, carried more than 350 aircraft. A 6M0s sharp as knives slicing wind, D3A Vals diving like bolts of lightning, and B5N Kates bearing bombs and torpedoes like steel hearts. All radios went dead. No signals, no stray lights, nothing thou that might let the Americans smell war coming. On the decks, young pilots tied white hachimaki around their heads, hands trembling slightly, eyes shining like drawn blades. They didn't know if they would return. They knew only that their mission, one that could change the fate of their nation, lay to the south, where Hawaii sat calm and blue like a piece of meat, unaware of the knife's shadow. Meanwhile, in Washington, scattered bits of intelligence fell into American hands like shards of a broken mirror that could not be pieced together. Reports of increased Japanese military activity, unusual radio silence, a diplomatic message between Tokyo and Washington missing its final section. But no one could assemble them into a coherent picture. General Short believed that if Japan attacked, it would strike the Philippines or Singapore. Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii kept training as usual. Anti-aircraft guns sat without ammunition. American planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on the runways to prevent sabotage, unknowingly arranged like a platter of targets if bombs fell from above. Pearl Harbor napped beneath warm sunlight, unaware it was about to become a graveyard of iron. On December 6th, a cold night draped itself over the Pacific like a mourning cloth. The Japanese fleet was now close enough for American radar to brush it, but no one grasped the meaning of the strange signals. In the cockpit of a carrier plane, a young pilot quietly touched a letter to his mother, hoping it would reach her, even if the messenger never returned. On the deck, torpedo detonators were uncapped. 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, reforged from naval shells, waited for the hour they would fall on Pearl Harbor like meteors. Everything was ready, down to the last millimeter. No alarms, no declaration of war, only wind, steel, and intent. Across the ocean, Americans brushed their teeth, ate breakfast, cleaned their ships, and fueled their aircraft as if tomorrow was still far away. But history was about to bite through that fragile peace with the jaws of bomb and fire. The tension no longer rose. It stood upright like a blade against the throat. Pearl Harbor needed only one launch order, one rev of an engine, and the Pacific sky would tear open like paper ripped by claws. And then, as the clock passed into the morning of December 7th, the space between two continents ceased to be silence. It became the breaking point of the old world, opening a new chapter where steel and flame would speak in place of diplomacy. From this moment forward, the timeline would surge straight into a battle history would never forget. The northern Pacific sky was as gray as a blade tempered in cold oil. On December 7th, 1941, before the clocks in Hawaii had even touched 6 a.m., the Kido Butai Strike Force had already unfolded across the ocean like a colossal steel spear aimed straight at Pearl Harbor. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, stretched across the dark water like pieces on a warboard. Each carrier was not merely a weapon, but a crucible of life and death, where hundreds of pilots stood on the edge between survival and oblivion. A total of 353 aircraft were prepared to launch in 2 waves. The A6M0s, light and swift as arrows, were tasked with seizing the sky and shielding the formation. The D3A Vals, dive-bombing Raptors, carried armor-piercing bombs meant to rip warships open. The B5N Kates, bearing upgraded torpedoes, were designed to punch through the bellies of battleships even in shallow harbor waters. The Type 91 torpedoes were fitted with special fins to prevent them from plunging too deep, turning a past Japanese weakness into a sharpened shark's tooth aimed at America's steel hulls. Guarding the outer ring were the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, and the cruisers Tone and Chikuma, their scout planes circling like vigilant hawks while destroyers formed a shell of steel around the fleet. The distance from Japan to Hawaii was over 4,000 nautical miles. Only carriers could bring war this far. Japan knew that if the mission failed, its finest forces would be swallowed by the ocean like an unmarked grave. Yet no radio cracked to life. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence hung over the fleet, like history swallowing before it roared. Across the ocean, the United States drifted lazily into a Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor, the largest American naval base in the Pacific, hosted 8 battleships, 7 cruisers, dozens of destroyers, and more than 300 aircraft at Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Ford Island. But none of it resembled a military alert. American aircraft were lined wing to wing to prevent sabotage, turning themselves into a perfect row of targets, needing only a few bursts from above to ignite like dry grass. Radar at Opana detected incoming aircraft at 7:02, but the signal was dismissed as a flight of B-17S arriving from the mainland. Anti-aircraft guns slept, barrels unturned, ammunition belts still boxed. The battleships lay motionless like a herd of sleeping elephants at the water's edge, powerful, majestic, and utterly unprepared. Japan's plan was crafted with surgical precision. The first wave of 183 aircraft, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, would strike battleships and airfields. Torpedoes skimmed low across the water. The valves would plunge like spears from the sky. If the massive American ships were crippled at the outset, the U.S. would lose the backbone of its Pacific fleet. The second wave, 170 aircraft, would strike next: oil tanks, repair yards, dry docks. If those targets burned, Pearl Harbor wouldn't simply take a blow to the heart. It would be paralyzed, unable to rise and counterattack. Aboard Akagi, Fuchida stood by the radio, headset pressed tight, engine noise thundering like a heartbeat. Wind rattled the cockpit glass, metal clinked like grinding teeth. The first pilot fastened his parachute, the last one locked his bomb. At several thousand meters, where the cold wind slashes skin, a young pilot gazed down at Hawaii, so peaceful and blue it almost hurt to look at. He knew that if he returned, the place below would no longer look the same. His hand rested on the control stick as though touching the fate of his nation. One breath, one tilt of the wing. History powered up its engines. Meanwhile, American forces remained wrapped in innocence. A sergeant straightened his scarf in the mirror. A group of sailors strummed guitars on the deck of the West Virginia, their soft singing drifting like the last echo of peacetime. A radar operator reported a strange signal but was ignored. A mechanic opened the ammunition locker, assuming today was just another day of weapon maintenance. No one looked to the sky. No one heard the explosion rushing toward them, like the opening cannon of a deadly symphony. The only thing missing was the moment the sword left its sheath. And then it came, swift as lightning, silent as a shadow. Through his cockpit glass, Fuchida saw the still waters of Pearl Harbor reflecting each American ship as clearly as if targets had been painted onto them. He tightened his grip on the microphone. He did not shout a slogan. He spoke one short line, clean, sharp, and final, like a blade slicing a decade-tightened string. Tora, Tora! Tora. Those words were not a battle cry. They were confirmation. The surprise attack had succeeded, and in the very next second, the Hawaiian sky shuddered as hundreds of aircraft roared downward like a pack of wolves charging a sleeping herd. Now everything would be measured in seconds. The Zeros swept down on Wheeler Field. The Vals dropped altitude like falling embers. The Kates skimmed the waves with torpedoes ready to strike American steel for the first time. 10 years of tension snapped. The bombs had not yet fallen, but war had already begun the moment Japan's planes locked onto their attack run. And from here, the sky would erupt. Steel would rend. Men would fall. Pearl Harbor would blaze like a chapter of scripture written in fire. The moment of collision was inches away. One more roar, and the sleeping fortress of steel would be torn apart. History could not step back. Morning broke, but peace was already dead, ready to yield to the opening blast of the Pacific's most devastating surprise attack. 6:48 a.m. The sky was still dim, gray like the eyelids of a warrior not yet fully awake. Then suddenly, without warning, the heavens over Hawaii split open as if slashed by a blade. Japanese steel birds burst through the clouds, engines roaring like starving beasts, the rising sun glinting off silver wings like swords striking straight at Pearl Harbor. Mitsuo Fuchida looked down through his cockpit glass. Below him, the American battleships lay neatly lined up like targets on a firing range. He uttered the short, cold command, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" And from that moment, everything exploded into motion. The once clear sky became a pressure chamber of engines, metal screaming through the air like the throat of a warrior diving into close combat. The first attack wave, 183 Japanese aircraft, split the morning apart. The Kates dropped low, skimming the water like sharks holding their breath, torpedoes glinting beneath them in the damp dawn air. They approached the American battleships on lines so straight and cold they felt almost surgical. The modified Type 91 torpedoes, designed not to plunge too deep in the harbor's shallow water, dropped from the aircraft like spears. At 6:53, the first explosion tore across the harbor, flames blooming red like the mouth of a newly awakened volcano. The USS Oklahoma was hit again and again, her hull shuddering like a wounded beast. Water flooded the compartments. The ship rolled and capsized, trapping 400 sailors inside a steel tomb whose lid had not yet fully closed. They pounded on the walls, their desperate knocks echoing like the dying heartbeat of the ship. No one heard in time. No one could reach them. On the USS Arizona, the sky suddenly flashed white like midday lightning. An 800-kilogram armor-piercing bomb dropped from over 3,000 meters, punched through the forward deck, and plunged into the main magazine. 8:10 a.m., a blinding white burst, like a second sun igniting. Arizona erupted. A pillar of flame nearly 200 meters high shot into the sky. The shockwave tore the steel deck apart. The ship's hull split like a massive tree struck by a divine axe. Over 1,100 men were incinerated in seconds, their screams swallowed by thick tar-black smoke. Shards of gun barrels and torn steel rained down into the harbor. Survivors staggered across burning decks, uniforms catching fire like dry grass. One sailor leapt into the sea to escape the flames, only to find the oil-slicked water itself burning, trapping him in a boiling nightmare. Japanese Zeros dove onto Hickam and Wheeler fields. American aircraft, parked wingtip to wingtip, were laid out like an exposed banquet of targets. Streams of 7.7mm tracers swept across them. 10, 20, then dozens of U.S. planes exploded within minutes. Barefoot American pilots sprinted across the tarmac, trying to climb into cockpits, but many planes never had time to start. A group of soldiers dragged a Browning M2 machine gun onto a wooden crate, exposed, firing blindly into the sky. Each round an act of defiance, each burst a final roar of a cornered animal. On Ford Island, the West Virginia took 7 torpedoes. Her hull sank slowly but did not roll. Sailors carried wounded comrades through smoke and fire, pulling them across compartments that felt like the floors of hell. A sergeant, burned across half his body, still managed to shove his friend toward the exit, skin tearing like worn cloth, but eyes fixed on survival. Nearby, the Nevada, one of the few ships able to get underway, pushed forward through smoke and flame. It looked like a burning giant, staggering but determined to reach open water. The Zeros spotted her movement and dove instantly. A bomb struck the stern, glowing red like molten iron. Unable to escape the harbor, Nevada surged onto a sandbank, sacrificing herself to avoid blocking the channel for other ships. The image carved itself into history. A burning spear shattered, yet still thrust forward to make a path for others. 8:30 a.m., the second wave descended. 170 Japanese aircraft dropped like a storm of blades. Their targets were fuel tanks, repair depots, aircraft hangars. The infrastructure that, if destroyed, would paralyze the U.S. Pacific Fleet for months. Bombs fell so thickly, the ground trembled like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Firefighters opened hoses only to dodge new explosions. Field hospitals overflowed, names shouted hoarsely through smoke that stung the eyes. Steel frames glowed red. Burning oil spread across the water like a wound spilling into the sea. Voices, gunfire, metal tearing. An orchestra of hell conducted by gravity and war. But amid the inferno, the first American counterattack took shape. Two U.S. pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, managed to take off in their P-40 Warhawks. They punched through the burning sky alone against a swarm of Vals and Zeros. Welch shot down 3 planes within minutes. Taylor's canopy cracked. Blood streaked his cheek, yet he pushed the throttle forward. The Warhawk engines howled like the awakening spirit of America. 9 a.m. The Hawaiian sky sagged under columns of smoke. The water turned dark red. Arizona gone. Oklahoma overturned. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, all severely damaged. Nearly 200 U.S. aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans dead. Thousands wounded. But one thing Japan could not touch. The U.S. aircraft carriers were not in the harbor. Those ships would define the future of the war, and they were still alive. As the final echoes of the attack faded, the sea still rumbled with the trapped breath of thousands of souls entombed in steel. Pearl Harbor was no longer a naval base. It was a smoking crater bleeding into the Pacific. And the moment the last bomb fell, the world shifted. Japan had landed the first blow, but the United States, the giant now awakened, stepped out of the darkness with eyes wider than ever before. The smoke of battle still hadn't lifted as the morning at Pearl Harbor crept toward noon. The water had turned thick with oil and iron ash, reflecting the flames like fragments of a broken sun falling into the sea. The attack was over, but no one could call this place peaceful. Wind rushed through the charred hulls of ships, creating a hollow, mournful sound, like steel crying. The USS Arizona lay on the harbor floor like a giant skeleton swallowed by soot, with 1,177 sailors forever trapped inside, never wrapped in flags, never returned home. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized, its keel facing the sky like a coffin flipped face down in the sea. More than 400 men were sealed within its iron darkness, their desperate banging echoing for 3 days before finally going silent, like a heart giving out. The Nevada, burning fiercely, had still fought to escape the harbor like a wounded animal seeking land. Her glowing hull was dragged onto a sandbank so she wouldn't block the channel for other ships. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland. None left the battle without wounds carved into them by torn steel, burning fuel, and the bodies of the dead. On the docks, survivors moved like shadows. Their eyes were red from smoke, their hands trembling from exhaustion and fear, yet no one was allowed to stop. Rescue teams lowered ladders into half-submerged hulls, listening for the faintest metallic taps from within, each knock like a drop of blood falling into the bay. For days, they drilled through steel, pried open plating, pulling men from the guts of ships. Some even sobbing, others dying with barely enough breath to whisper their mother's name. Navy doctors worked through shaking hands, wiping sweat with elbows stained in blood. Bandages turned from white to pink to brown. The smell of burned flesh mixed with oil, hot metal, seawater, and death. A scent that would never leave the memory of anyone who stood there. By the afternoon of December 7th, the first casualty report was written. Cold and clean, as though it hadn't come from hell. 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded, 4 battleships sunk, 4 others severely damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, major losses to fuel stores and repair facilities. But numbers cannot tell the whole story. They don't mention the sailor who swam through burning water to pull a friend out, then sank from exhaustion himself. They don't mention the young faces turned to black ash on the deck of the Arizona. They don't mention the letters in breast pockets that would never reach their homes. Numbers cannot contain the choked screams in oil-thick air, nor the century-long silence that followed the last tapping inside the Oklahoma. The next morning, December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped before Congress. His face was drawn tight from a sleepless night. His voice rang out slow and heavy like a bronze bell. A date which will live in infamy. Congress voted for war, only one dissenting vote. The United States rose as if a wounded giant, muscles tightening instantly. Steel mills in Pittsburgh glowed red through the night. Detroit's factories switched from cars to tanks. Seattle thundered with rivets for new carriers. 17 and 18-year-old boys lined up at recruiting stations, some still in school uniforms, eyes steady and unflinching. America was no longer a bystander. It had entered the war in full force. Tokyo greeted the victory with fireworks, flags waving over the Diet Building. Newspapers mocked America, calling Pearl Harbor the triumph that would usher in a new divine wind. But among the cheers, those who understood strategy fell silent. Yamamoto, the man who designed the strike, did not toast, did not smile. He knew Japan had not defeated the United States. It had merely awakened it. Japan seized Singapore, Malaya, swept into the Dutch East Indies, and seized the oil it needed. But behind those months of celebration loomed the vast shadow of American industrial power. Yamamoto had warned, "For the first 6 months, I will run wild. After that, I can guarantee nothing." 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States answered. April 1942, the Doolittle Raid. American bombers launching from a carrier striking Tokyo. Minor damage, enormous meaning. Japan was no longer safe. War had touched their home. 2 months later came Midway. In just 3 days, Japan lost 4 of its core carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the very ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. The heart of the Kido Butai was ripped apart, flags falling into a storm of fire. From that point onward, the war changed direction. The U.S. advanced island by island across the Pacific: Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, each step a tightening steel ring around Japan. By 1945, Japan stood at the edge of hopelessness. Okinawa drowned in blood. Tokyo burned in firestorms. Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose under white mushroom clouds, a dawn not meant for humankind. The empire of the rising sun collapsed, surrendering unconditionally. Every road to that surrender began on the morning of December 7th, 1941. A victory so immense, it opened the path to an even greater defeat. Pearl Harbor ripped the 20th century in half. It pulled America into the war and pushed Japan onto a path with no exit. It reshaped the global map. The United States emerged as a superpower. Japan lost its empire, yet was reborn as an industrial nation after the war. And today, beneath the waters of Hawaii, where oil still seeps from the Arizona, people lay white flowers on the dark surface. Because even though time has passed, the explosion of that day has never truly gone silent. It still pulses through history like warm blood. And one question lingers. If those American aircraft carriers had been in Pearl Harbor that morning, burning and sinking alongside the battleships, would the Pacific War have turned in the opposite direction? And would the story of our world be written in entirely different colors? The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just the sound of bombs on a Sunday morning in 1941. It was the cracking sound of an entire world splitting. It closed an era of hesitation and opened an age in which industrial might, strategy, and national will became the blade that shaped destiny. From the oil-stained, tear-soaked waters of Hawaii, history turned sharply, pulling the United States into World War II, not with warnings, but with blood and fire. The guns have long since fallen silent, yet their echo still resonates in the depths of the ocean, where the Arizona sleeps beneath dark water and where the souls of thousands of sailors seem still to stand at attention in the shadow of steel. The world never returned to what it had been, its map of power redrawn, the footsteps of an ascendant America pounding across every front, and Japan forced to accept its final lesson under the unyielding glare of nuclear fire in 1945. If history is a film that cannot be rewound, then Pearl Harbor is the scene that cannot be cut. A long, smoke-filled shot, blazing with fire and the pounding heartbeat of an age of steel and ambition. Today, looking back, we see not only sinking warships and falling bombs, but a warning that never grows old. Power without prudence turns glory into a double-edged blade. The attack ended, but the next chapter of the war lay ahead. Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. Each name a blood-red milestone in America's rise to superpower status and the collapse of Imperial Japan. If you want to continue the journey through America's counterstrike in the Pacific, carrier duels burning across the horizon, island-hopping armies, pilots skimming the sea like predators, stay with us. Tap subscribe so that when the engines roar again on your screen, you won't miss the next moment in history. Pearl Harbor has ended, but the Pacific War has only just begun.